We are delighted to bring you one of our encore episodes here. These would be our previously aired episodes that have had extensive downloads and re-listens. And so we bring you the best of the best from our previous shows. Enjoy.
Mission critical leadership. Leaders today need to lead in all directions, up, across, down, and inward. This is an important skill and one I think we would agree the world needs now more than ever. Both ministries and marketplaces are facing conditions that have been described as volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, to the point that even the most seasoned leaders are struggling to build meaningful relationships while at the same time delivering measurable results. Thankfully, the world has coaches, life coaches and leadership coaches like you who can equip and encourage powerful leaders who can positively impact the world. All right. Before I introduce our special guest for today, I need to quickly mention what you may have already noticed, that our co-host Chris McCluskey was unable to join us today, but he definitely sends his regards. Joining me today as our special guest is Jon Lockhorst. Chris McCluskey and I have both known Jon for over 5 years. And during that time, it's been a joy to watch his career and his coaching practice grow in its depth and breadth. Jon Lockhorst is a CPA turned professional certified coach, who's also a leadership coach, a keynote speaker, corporate trainer, adjunct faculty member, and in his capacity today as the author of a brand new book, Mission Critical Leadership: How Smart Managers Lead Well in All Directions. Before launching Lockhorst Consulting, Jon enjoyed a 30-plus year career as a CPA, CFO, and organizational leader. And on a personal note, I can't help but mention that Jon loves grandparenting, as do I, and he's called Papa by his 4 adorable littles. Welcome to the podcast today, Jon.
Thank you, Kim. It's great to be with you. And it's always good to have a conversation. And you and Chris and the PCCI community have been such an integral part of that growth in my business and in my life over the past 5 years.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. It's fun to watch how God works in each of us and then sends us out in different mission fields to minister in the world. To catch our leaders up on that, can you share a little bit about how is it that a CPA became a coach?
That is an excellent question, Kim. And there's a very jagged career path that I have followed. I think the coaching side really comes out of part of my makeup, and that is about professional and personal development. I can go back and trace throughout my entire career an interest in that in my own life in terms of my own self-development, as well as in the development of others. And even though I didn't really know what coaching was at the time, as I started to move into leadership roles, I found that that was the approach that I took to leadership, was a coach approach. And so it was really natural for me as I continued down that path and the interest in leadership and organizational development, and what would it look like to invest this next season of my career in that way. Coaching was a very obvious part of that.
It really is a natural route when you look at it from the personal development and professional development angle. And I love that you, like most of the coaches we encounter, are pretty serious about our own personal and professional development. Having said that, coaches can choose a number of niches, but your passion was particularly for leadership and leadership development. What's important about that?
I look at the world that my grandkids, the littles, as you referred to them earlier, are growing up in, and what is it going to take to create a better place for them to grow up? What is it going to take to have better schools and better communities and better churches, better youth activities, and ultimately the workplaces that they're going to go to work in? The only way that those institutions, those organizations get better is with better leadership. So if we want the world to be a better place, we've got to raise up better leaders. And so that was a natural place for me to invest. And like I said earlier, I've always had a strong interest and passion for leadership, even though that might not have been a part of a formal role or a formal title that I had at any given time.
Leadership is important. And I'll confess that I love to read leadership books and get inspired and read the examples and hear the principles and delve into people's stories. But reading about leadership and studying leadership is actually very different than leading. So I'm going to confess that in my own life, either as a follower or a leader, it's a whole lot messier than it would appear. What are some of the challenges people face as they enter maybe their first or their next level of leadership?
I think one of the biggest challenges, especially for someone who's entering into their first leadership role, is that a lot of the skills, the knowledge that helped you to perform well in that first role as an individual contributor is the term that we often use. That doesn't always translate into effective leadership. There can be a very different skill set and very different behaviors that you need to perform well as a leader, as opposed to doing, say, the technical side of your job. And as you mentioned earlier, I come from a CPA background, so people who have a strong background in accounting, those skills are great, but they don't always translate into effective leadership. So I think that's one of the first challenges, is just recognizing that there's a need for different skills, different behaviors, different habits. And then from there, it's that continued investment that you need, because as you get further in your leadership career, you tend to have broader responsibility within the organization that you lead. And so you might go from leading a more narrow functional area or a more narrow team in the beginning to having to lead a department or a division or even an entire company at some point along the way. And at each of those levels, it requires a little different mindset and a little different focus of leadership.
Yes, there are challenges all along the way. So to help our listeners envision this, I would love it if you could flesh this out with a personal example, perhaps of someone you worked with as a coach who is facing some of these struggles as they grew in leadership responsibility.
I think it's really fortunate, the example that I have, the leadership saw potential in someone. It was a rising star within their organization, someone that worked in an IT role. And they wanted to support this person, recognizing that that move into a leadership role was not necessarily going to be an easy one, that there were going to be some bumps along the way. This individual grabbed onto the opportunity for coaching and really invested himself in that experience, came very prepared with great questions and areas to work on. From one session to the next, brought practical real life situations that were indicative of that transition that I mentioned earlier, from being an individual contributor to now being responsible for the work of others. And I always get a kick out of, some of those early career leaders that one of the biggest challenges and frustrations that they feel is, well, if I didn't have to deal with all of the issues of the people on my team, I could actually get my work done. To which my response is, you're a leader. The issues and challenges of those team members, that is your work. And it's just going to become more and more so as you advance and move along. So I think that was one of the really one of those pivotal moments for that individual, is just recognizing, now I'm not just responsible for my own work per se, I've also got to oversee the work of a number of other people.
Which, as you said, is an entirely different skill set. And I can think of a call I got one time, Jon, and maybe you can tell me how I could have handled it differently, but it was from a board of directors that was having a difficult time getting along with and coming to consensus on almost everything, because of one particularly, they described it, difficult, stubborn, hard to work with person who sat on the board of directors. And they wanted to hire me to work with him. And they hadn't even asked him or approached him about the fact that they were having a difficult time getting along. And I just had to give that a huge NO, that was not going to be at work because there was no buy-in on that individual's part. Was there another way I could have handled it? Or what do you do when someone actually doesn't have the self-awareness that they're not a great leader?
I think there's two sides to that scenario, Kim, the way you described it. And I can definitely see why you would put the NO out there as far as a response, because, when you have an organization or you have a leader that comes to you and as a coach and essentially wants you to do the dirty work for them, they don't want to confront the performance issue. They want to confront the obnoxious, abrasive behavior. So let's get a coach. Let's find somebody from the outside. And it can be really hard to go into a coaching relationship like that, because, how transparent can you be? Hey, your boss called me in here because they've got all these problems, when perhaps the boss hasn't shared those problems that they have with that individual. So it almost sounds like before you could coach that individual on the board, you needed to coach those other board members on how they could approach that person and address some of the behaviors that they were seeing. Maybe it wasn't the individual that needed the coach as much as it was those other board members.
Oh, I absolutely agree. Fortunately, I was not associated with any of them, so I actually didn't have to say yes. But if I had been coaching that team, that sounds like a really good way to handle it. In the title of your book and in your book, you talk about leading in all directions. Can we unpack each of those briefly? For example, we typically think of leaders as leading down, not down in importance, but on the organizational chart and in terms of responsibility. Leaders are in charge of people who are below them on the organizational chart. What are some of the skills and challenges that come with that?
I think the typical view of leadership is just what you described. It's more of that downstream on the organizational hierarchy. And I like that you emphasize that it's not downward in terms of the value or the importance of those people, but the typical organizational hierarchy has the executive level at the top and the individual contributors at the bottom. And so that focuses really on being a good boss to the people that you lead. And as we'll explore, that's not the only way to view leadership. In fact, it's an incomplete view of leadership. But I do think that when it comes to leading your team, one of the critical behaviors right now is that of engagement. How do you fully engage your team members? And that's not just in the tactical work that they're doing. It's not just the day-to-day routines, the operational activities that they're responsible for, but it's also engaging with them in their development so that they're not only able to succeed and to thrive and to grow in the role they're in right now, but they're being proactively prepared for whatever might come next, whether that's advancing into a leadership role down the road or perhaps some kind of a lateral move. I think what often gets overlooked is the career path of that individual and where do they want to go? What are the skills that they want to learn, the experiences that they want to have? And if you're not careful as a boss, you can get really short-sighted on what's important today and not think about the bigger long-term picture. If you're not paying attention to that in this day, it's real easy for people to disengage and then start looking for other opportunities.
And there is such competition for good talent out there. They can easily find those other opportunities, and the cost of turnover and rehiring and retraining is enormous. People think of those as soft skills, some of those more career moves that you talk about. But I think today's employee almost expects and demands that kind of whole person approach.
Absolutely. And what's interesting, Kim, is the research actually bears out the fact that the early career workers, they crave coaching. They want leaders who are going to coach them, not just tell them what to do, not just teach them. There's certainly some value there in teaching skills and all that, but they really are looking for leaders that have a coach approach because they see that as an opportunity to engage, to take ownership, and to actively participate in their own learning and development and to actively participate in their own career trajectory as well.
Yeah, definitely increases engagement. So that is the typical model that we think of when we think about leadership. You also talk about leading across. What do you mean by across and what's involved with that?
Well, leading across, I consider to be the most complex form of leadership because now you're talking peer to peer in an organization. And let's just say that we were both department leaders within an organization. And I think I can safely just use some of our prior experience in this. You're the director of marketing. I'm the director of finance. I'm not the boss of you. You're not the boss of me. But at times we're going to need specific deliverables from one another. We're going to need resources and we're going to need information. And so we can't go in with the role power that you have when you're leading your team, where you are the boss. I can't just come in and tell you what to do. We've got to find ways to collaborate together. And that can be really challenging because you start to see some of the silos in organizations and people that are protecting their turf. And there's that feeling of being threatened by your peers at times. There's internal competition in a lot of organizations. And so really, when you don't have that role power, you're relying almost entirely on influence to be able to lead across among your peers. And how do you develop a relationship of influence where if I'm coming from the finance perspective to marketing for something that we need for our team or we need as part of an organization-wide project, you're actually going to want to participate. You're going to want to collaborate with me because we've built that kind of relationship where we see the greater good of the organization as having more importance than, say, our individual silos.
And that's definitely the goal. But I will say in real world practice, perhaps the person that I'm trying to collaborate with, cooperate with, or we're sharing resources and trying to divide it up equally or in a good manner, sometimes that other person doesn't have a win-win mindset. So I'm curious, how would you coach me if I were the person who wanted to create a win-win and the person across from me was that defensive siloed mindset?
I think the only way that you start to break down some of those defenses is by building a relationship. It's the same way that you would build any relationship. You know, it's not just about what you need from that person or what you want from that person, but taking a real interest in that person individually. And it's not really any different than, you know, if you think about the team that you lead, you know, they want to know that you view them as a real person with their own needs and challenges, that they're not just a cog in the wheel. I think that's true in peer-to-peer relationships as well. And so when you can show that person that, you know, ultimately it's not just what you want from them, but what do you want for them? You know, how do you help that individual so that there's some good give and take in that relationship? How do they see that you've got their best interests at heart? It's not just always a matter of coming to them when you need something from them, but finding ways that you can be of service to that individual as well.
It's definitely a long game and not a quick fix, but so important. And if I could just add in almost a parenthesis, an advantage I think we have as believers is that we don't have to, and I've had people ask me that, how do I show them I care? How do I make them believe I care? For us, it's easier. We actually really care. We don't just have to demonstrate or sell someone else on the idea or make them believe the idea. It actually starts with that heart work between me and the Lord, such that if you were that other person that I was trying to work with, Jon, I actually really cared about you. And in some ways, I think that's hard to hide. I think over time, perhaps maybe not immediately, you would sense the authenticity and the reality of that connection. And non-believers or people who are just trying to use one another to get the next step up the ladder, it's also hard for them to hide that. That comes across and it makes that relationship building that's so important really difficult.
I think you're right. And if that's not the case, if there's not that differential from someone who professes to be a believer, I think it's time for some soul searching, some gut check, if you will, because we do have the advantage of the Holy Spirit working in us and through us to demonstrate that care and concern, to demonstrate that interest, and to really take the time to invest in those other people.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful, beautiful process. And we'll get to the inward leadership work in a minute. I want to end with that. But next, I want to go to leading up. And again, from personal experience, oh my goodness. It is so hard to influence the person above you, especially when, let me say this, it's not just a person, but it's a culture within a church, within a ministry, a nonprofit, or in a for-profit business. I have been in positions, I'm almost always in positions where people are above me because actually I don't like to be the buck stops here kind of gal, but I do want to influence and lead up and have a positive impact. And it's tough to swim against a negative tide sometimes. So I can't wait to hear your tips for this.
The reality, Kim, is most people are in the same position that you just described. And whether they want to be the top dog in their organization or not, very few people ever get to that level of being CEO or executive director or whatever that title might be. There's also a good chance that if you get to that place, that you aren't without a boss. Unless you own your own business, there's a pretty good chance you've got a board of directors that you're going to have to report to. So honestly, when it comes to developing leadership skills, I think leading upward is one of the best places to start, because even if you're just fresh out of school in your first career-oriented job, you're going to have to learn how to do that right away. And I really think the only way that you can get down that road and start to develop that opportunity for upward leadership is by building unwavering trust with your boss. It's showing your boss that you take your work seriously, that you can deliver on the expectations, that you're reliable and trustworthy. But I think it even goes beyond that, because at a certain point, you may have to bring bad news to your boss. You might have to bring perhaps less than favorable results to your boss. And how you do that, how you enter into those conversations is also part of building that trust and getting that confidence that your boss is going to have in you. So it's really tough to navigate. But when you're intentionally think about what are all those behaviors that I can exhibit that will build trust with my boss, and you start working on those, great opportunity for coaching is to just kind of walk through a typical day or a typical week and say, where are those opportunities for me to build trust? And where's the risk that my actions, my behaviors, or even my words might erode that trust?
Or be misunderstood. An interesting thing that I've discovered personally over the years is one of the best ways to build trust is to make mistakes. Bear with me here, and own them.
Absolutely.
I can think of one or two particular instances where I made a mistake, one that really had, a lot of impact in the moment. And there was the opportunity in both of those instances to not own up to it and to know that nobody would ever really know who made that mistake and never really know the cost of that mistake. And that's just not my MO. That's not the way I'm going to do. So with much fear and trepidation, I can think of one particular example. I was almost crying when I picked up the phone and called the person above me to say, I have to tell you what happened, and both of those instances, the relationship was better. The trust was deeper. I remember one particular boss, years later, something happened and I said, well, I did this. She said, Kim, that's just your overly sensitive conscious talking. I'm used to you and I know you'll always come clean and please don't sweat it. And I thought, I'm glad she saw that I have a conscience and I always respond to it. So just some personal learning along those lines.
But part of the reason that you got that response is that you had been building that trust all along. So when you're building that trust, when you do make a mistake, in some ways, it's like taking some of that trust out of the bank. It's taking some of the reserves, because now your boss hopefully can trust that it's an honest mistake, that it wasn't something intentional, that it wasn't something that was very negligent. It was just one of those routines where perhaps, it's clicking on the wrong box on a computer screen, or it's just making a decision about whether to spend money or not to spend money that didn't turn out as well as you'd hoped. There's that sense that, okay, yep, this was maybe a setback, but on the whole, what I see in Kim is a trustworthy person. And I also know that because she's owning up to this mistake, that she's going to learn from it. She's going to grow. She's able then to take on more responsibility.
Yeah, it was counterintuitive, and I'm thankful for those experiences. One, humility is always a good thing to learn and relearn, but also for my clients to help them think outside the box. God has got our back. We need to live in accordance with our values, high integrity, develop high trust, and know that whatever the results, God has us, but it almost always turns out better in the long run. All right. So this brings us to the final way you address leadership. And I think it's one that the coaches work most in the area, and that is that inward leadership. So define that for us.
Well, self-leadership is really the place to start, because if you want to lead others well, you've got to first learn how to lead yourself well. And there's also a mantra that all leadership starts with self-leadership. It's really not a whole lot different than leading anyone else. It just happens to be your biggest challenge. People will ask the question, well, what do you find is the biggest challenge as you work with leaders? Well, the biggest challenge happens to be the person that looks back at you from the mirror, because leading yourself can be the toughest person of all to lead. It's a matter of influencing yourself to the right behaviors, to productive behaviors and conversations, the actions and the habits that are going to help you move in the direction of the vision that hopefully God has planted within you. And so there's that constancy, and there's very small decisions and choices that you make from day to day that either move you in that right direction or take you off course. And then there are some of those larger life decisions that come along the way, and you have an opportunity either further move down that path toward the vision or get off course. And so there's that constant influencing to do the right thing and to do the best thing, to engage in some of the challenges that you have to face into, because the road to leadership is not an easy, smooth one. It's not a flat, straight path. It's a winding road. There's a lot of potholes and divots along the way that you have to travel along. So it's really about developing that consistency and faithfulness over time.
For sure. And that's why there's probably the number of leaders that we truly have worked with that we respect can be numbered on one hand, which is sad. And we would all love to help change that. If you could just switch hats for a minute then, Jon, from your leadership consulting hat and all the knowledge that you bring us in your book, put on your coaching hat. We have a lot of life and leadership coaches who listen to this podcast and they're thinking, okay, if I have all this knowledge, how does this work out one-on-one in my relationship with either the client or the team that I've been hired to work with? From a coaching perspective, how is this work done?
Yeah, I think it is an inside-out process, which lends itself really well to coaching. I would start with the self-leadership side, because your self-leadership is going to come out of some of those core elements that I call the personal foundation. You mentioned the word values earlier, and I mentioned the word vision. Vision, values, purpose, mission, all of those words that all creates that personal foundation. And I think a natural place to start, and doesn't have to be a person in a leadership role, it can be any individual that you would do coaching with, is to help them to discover that personal foundation. And I'm sure you've found this to be true as well. It really is a process of discovery. Sometimes we think it's a creation process, and there's some element to that, and even some of the wordsmithing and whatever that you would come up with to articulate that. But a lot of that is already there within the person, that vision and those values that they want to live by. And the coach is such an integral part of drawing that out and helping to put a framework around that makes sense and provides meaning and hopefully motivation for that individual in whatever it is that they want to have coaching around. So I think that's really at the core, the starting point is helping that person really understand that personal foundation that they're working from.
So their vision, their mission, their purpose, their values, that work that most of us came into coaching to do because we love that inside out work so much. Is that the same place you would start with when you were working with a team, or do they tend to want you to jump into, okay, we're in the middle of a shift, change, or crisis, and Jon, help?
Yeah, that's an easy trap to fall into, is to neglect some of that core foundation. And while many times that's already in place, it's helpful to revisit that. And one of the questions that I've just asked recently with an executive team was, now, as far as your overall mission and values, your vision and all of that, is any of that on the table here? Or is that solid? Do you have alignment around that? Because sometimes you step back and you realize the team is not all aligned around the vision and the mission. And so just another example of a firm that reached out and wanted to utilize my services as a facilitator for strategic planning. And I always like to ask that question, where are you at in terms of that foundation? Because sometimes the strategic planning can be a smokescreen for other problems that need to be addressed first. And I think that can be true whether it's organization wide or at a team level. So it's always good to ask the question, even though it may not lead to diving in specifically to that area. You may move fairly quickly from that into more of the tactical issues of the day.
That's beautiful. I would love if you would share a kind of behind the scenes peek of the underbelly of your business for our listeners for a minute. You talked about speaking. Obviously, you've written a book. I know you do consulting. You do team development. I know you're a coach. How does this all fit together into a life and employment that you love?
I wish I could claim credit for the concept or even the phrase for it, but it was one of your former guests, Jeff Goins, that gave me this idea of a portfolio business.
Mm-hmm.
And so my portfolio is all focused on leadership and organizational development. There are just different ways, different approaches to get to that. And so it does include individual coaching, team facilitation, training, speaking, and now doing writing as well. So it's a combination. I think of it as having multiple arrows in the quiver. And that's not necessarily for everyone. There are some people who love purely to do coaching and they're not as interested in doing speaking and training. And that's fine. I think, part of this is just you're having to define your own business model and how you want to go about it. I happen to enjoy all of those approaches. And if you were to ask me on any given day, is there one of those that you would want to do more of than the other? I might give you a different answer today than what I would have given somebody else last week, because I just enjoy all of those different ways of going at leadership development.
I do think coaching is the perfect field for people who are multi-passionate entrepreneurs. It does allow us to put in our own unique mix of tools and ways that we serve others in the world. I happen to have been in on a conversation with you maybe 2 or 3 years ago now when you were creating a 5-year vision. All right, so we're midway probably through your 5-year vision. But my guess is, if I recall correctly, it's probably not exactly the way you envisioned it in your journal and on your vision board. What advice would you give to someone else who's just starting out and they have a grand vision, but perhaps there's some detours ahead for them?
I remember those conversations well, Kim. And yeah, you're right. It's about not quite halfway into that 5-year vision. And incidentally, that 5-year vision really did relate much to the book, and not even as much the book itself, but my paradigm, my view and perspective on leadership. So I think the first thing that I would say is you've always got to be ready to adapt to different circumstances. You've always got to be willing to flex. Since that 5-year vision was articulated, we had this small disruption that popped up called COVID-19. And so that, just like it has for so many others and so many businesses, that's thrown things off course a little bit as far as the path that I was on. And I'm glad to see that, I'm starting to get back to where I was before COVID in some of those areas. So I think it's an iterative process. I like the idea of the 5-year vision from that conversation, because when you put a time frame to a vision, there's a sense of urgency about it. It's not that there's anything wrong with a vision that's more open-ended, but it's too easy to procrastinate and go, yeah, well, that's out there. I'll get there when I'm 50 or 60 or 70. And when you put a time frame to it, it creates that sense of urgency. And one of the greatest examples in history that we have of that was President Kennedy in 1961, declaring that the vision was to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade and get him back to the earth safely. And I always wonder, if he hadn't put that phrase in there, by the end of this decade, if there had been the same sense of urgency. So I think that's one piece of advice that I would give, is as you create that vision, go ahead and put a time frame on it. There's plenty of flexibility. You're not Apple, you're not Amazon, where there's zillions of people that are dependent on that. You get to decide, you get to drive this. And so you can iterate as you go along.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Keep the big picture in mind, but adapt along the way, because that certainly is necessary when small disruptors like COVID-19 happen. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom today. I do want to share your book and where people can find it with those who are listening. So again, the name of Jon's book is Mission Critical Leadership: How Smart Managers Lead Well in All Directions. And you can learn more about that at missioncriticalleadership.com. It's just the way it sounds, missioncriticalleadership.com. Jon also has a sample chapter. Is that correct, that people can download for free?
Yeah, if you go to that page at the URL, Kim, that you mentioned, about a third of the way down, there's an orange button. You can download a sample chapter. You don't have to put an email, no strings attached, just there as a resource, a way for you to check it out.
Well, we appreciate your time and your gifts and the way you're serving God in this world. Thank you, Jon.
Thank you. It's been great to have this conversation.
All right. Until next time, keep raising the standard of coaching and changing the world. God's richest blessings to you.